Well, good morning to all my friends and to the gathering place. And let me wish you a very blessed Easter on this day, even though if it's not going to be a very familiar one. We are, of course, in a coronavirus lockdown, which is why we're doing these videos. And I just pray over and over again that this will all end soon so that we can be together. Because this is YouTube, there is the possibility that other people are actually going to see this. So before we get into the story, I want to explain a little bit about what we actually do when we're doing this subject. We're in the midst of a series called The Life and Times of Jesus Christ, where we are trying to look at it from a chronological perspective as to what happened to him throughout his life and especially through his ministry. As such, we have to take into consideration the fact that the gospel writers themselves did not look at it necessarily as let's do this chronologically. Sometimes they chose to do it thematically, sometimes they chose to do it chronologically, sometimes they just chose based on, gosh, oh, I got to tell this story. So they put that one down and then come up with another story after that. The result is that we sometimes have a mishmash of what is happening. The other thing is that the gospel writers, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, known as, since their gospels are known as the synoptics, they uh, told some of the same stories to more, well, they told some of the same stories to, and with different eyewitness versions. So we need to look at the Gospels, and what we do here is we mash them all up. So if, as in today's story, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all contributors to the story, we're going to take all the facts from each one of them and put them into a single gospel. In doing so, sometimes it's going to work out nice and easy, and sometimes it doesn't. But it works for us on that part of it. The other thing is that while we are in this multi-year series of the life and times of Jesus Christ, we are also in a little tiny mini series on what we are discussing today. Basically, we are talking about four very distinctive miracles. These four very distinctive miracles are primarily, Mark is primarily the main author for them, and that he gives us the most facts. But it also means that, like I said, we're going to mash them all together. Mark is known more for being thematic in his writing than he is chronological, and yet these four miracles look very, there's too many facts within them that look like they came one right after another. As a matter of fact, these four miracles likely took place in a 24 to 48 hour time span, where literally the apostles were getting miracle whiplash in doing so. Um, just to review a little bit, a few weeks ago we talked about Jesus leaving his base in Capernaum and wanting to go to the other side of the lake being Lake Gennesaret, also known as the Sea of Galilee. And the other side of the lake would have meant he was going to be leaving Galilee, leaving the Jewish areas, and going to Decapolis, which was a Greek area. In the midst of going over there, his first miracle was to calm a storm. We look at Jesus and he was exhausted. He gets into a boat. His disciples join him. They go across the sea, and up comes a storm, and the apostles are absolutely terrified. So terrified that they wake Jesus up and say, "We're getting ready to drown here." And as Jesus gets up, probably yawns, chastises the wind, chastises the waves, everything comes to a perfect calm, and he goes back to sleep. Not before challenging the faith of his disciples. The next, but again, this is um, demonstrates his power over nature itself. The second miracle, when he arrived in the region of the Gerasenes near Gadara, he runs into demon possession. A demon would probably a person who has more demons in him than any other recorded time, because the demon himself actually called himself Legion. There, Jesus removes him, or removes the demons from this man, and which demonstrates his power over the spiritual powers of the world. Well, unfortunately, the other people there in Gadara were not all that thrilled with the fact that Jesus had rescued this man from being demon possessed, since they had lost a whole bunch of pigs at the same time. So they asked Jesus to leave, and Jesus obliged them. And that's where we are going to be picking up our story today, with a different theme as far as what Jesus' power is, and at the same time, uh, finishing off these themes of what his miracles could be. So let's read. This is from Mark chapter 5, Luke chapter 8, and Matthew chapter 9. So, when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him and welcomed him while he was still by the lake. Now remember, when Jesus left, there was a huge crowd of people there. They're in Capernaum. Actually, I shouldn't say Capernaum because we don't really know, but the speculation is that he was in Capernaum, he returned to Capernaum. The crowd he left sees him arriving again, and they all come back to him immediately. The Gentiles over there in Decapolis didn't even want him to hang out. He comes back, and they're all clamoring for him and wanting to get near him and to hear from him again. So seeing the boats, the crowd returns. It kind of brings up, why did Jesus leave them in the first place? We looked at it from several perspectives, one of them being that he had a divine appointment with the demoniac and needed to go there. But others, speculations are that, one, he was exhausted by the crowd, and that would show with why he fell asleep immediately upon getting in the boat. Another one is that he was frustrated with the Jews at that point because he had been showing them miracle after miracle, and yet they still were not getting around to repenting. They weren't getting around to really following his teachings. All they wanted to do was see his miracles and receive his blessings, and not take on the responsibilities of understanding that the kingdom of heaven is near. So when they come back, they're thrilled to have him back. They're excited to have him back. However, he's going to get interrupted almost immediately here. It says that then one of the synagogue rulers by the name of Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him. My little daughter is dying. Please come to my house and put your hands on her so she will be healed and live. She is my only daughter and only 12. Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Now, a synagogue ruler is not a priest, but it is a very prominent honorary title, and it's often given to people that are administrators in the synagogue or have some special foundation that, you know, as far as building or what can be done in the synagogue. And so this was an honorary title, but the person would be considered extremely important, much like, say, the elders in one of our churches today. Jairus is desperate enough at this point to interrupt Jesus. He's seeking him out, and something has happened. If I'm correct in that it's only been a day, possibly two, between when Jesus left and when he returns, this little girl got sick very quickly. I think of it and look at it like, okay, possibly a severe asthma attack. I know I grew up with asthma as a kid, and the first time it happened, I was still under 2 years old, and my parents were absolutely panic stricken to see me gasping for air. Uh, it we are in the midst of a coronavirus where, again, people can get sick extremely quickly. And all of a sudden, they seem healthy at one point, and all of a sudden they cannot breathe again. And I picture that is something along those lines that this little girl is suffering with. So, like I said, Jairus is trying to interrupt Jesus' homecoming in order to do this. Now, Jesus' reaction is immediate. He immediately gets up and starts going with Jairus. But he's going to be interrupted by somebody else as well. And this is a woman who was cursed with a bleeding issue. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. Indeed, as Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched the edge of his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Well, the crowd, not wanting to lose him again, followed after Jesus in such a way. They're all trying to touch him. They're all trying to get close to him. They're all trying to see if there isn't some blessing that Jesus is getting ready to offer. And as such, they're all trying to touch him, but only one of them is trying to touch him for mercy, for what she has suffered. Now, we need to understand what the Jewish traditions were on this. The first one, part of it is known as nida. Nida is uncleanness, and it is an uncleanness for the issue of menstrual blood. In Leviticus chapters 18, verse 19, it reads this: do not approach a woman to have sexual relations during the uncleanness of her monthly period. If you do so, both man and woman would be unclean for 7 days. Now, it goes a lot deeper than just that. Again, if we read Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 through 33, we discover that if a woman in her menstrual period is or having any kind of flow out of her body, if she lies down on a mattress or sits in a chair, she has made those unclean. Her clothes are unclean. And anyone that lies down on that mattress or sits in that chair or touches her clothes is also unclean. Now, we're used to recognizing that lepers, for example, had to walk around and say, unclean, unclean, to let everybody know that they had to move aside, or because if they come too close, they are likely to get the leprosy. We know that that's not possible for other people to get whatever this woman had. However, she is still unclean in many respects. So if you think about it, she either has a perpetual menstruation or some sort of uterine infection or vaginal infection that is causing her to bleed. And she has had this problem for 12 years. Now that means that ceremonially, she's unclean. She cannot go to the synagogue. She cannot go to the temple. She cannot go to worship. She cannot sit down in places where other people might be coming to sit or to lie down. So even the members of her own family have to rebuke her in some respect if they, because otherwise they spend all of their time just trying to wipe up what has already been done. At the end of your time period, for how long you are unclean if something like this happens, you then have to go take a mikveh. This is basically a ritual bath. Clothes have to be cleaned, mattresses, chairs, etc. Okay. Now, she comes with a very strange little bit of faith here. She says, if I can just touch his clothes, then I will be healed. Now, this is a silly superstition for that time period. We have, and it's actually more Greek than it is Jewish. But the idea was that a person of power would have that power flowing through their clothes as well. I'm reminded that Lloyd Douglas wrote a sensational book that was made into a movie with Richard Burton, Gene Simmons, Victor Mature. It was called The Robe. And if you recall the movie, and I'm assuming that most of my class remembers it relatively well, the movie starts off with Richard Burton as Marcus Gallio. And Marcus Gallio is the centurion that ends up leading the troops to crucify Christ. And he ends up winning the robe that Jesus wore by rolling the dice. And so he took it. Now, Victor Mature, his slave, had recently come to just fall in love with Jesus Christ. And so he took the robe for the centurion. But when the centurion put it on, he went into a deep state of fear and just didn't know what to do. I mean, it was almost a form of insanity. And he ran from the robe and wouldn't touch it. But he went off back to Rome, and he still couldn't get over it. And so somebody mentions to him that he had to go and get the robe and burn it. So he starts a journey to go and find the robe, and instead he finds his own Christianity. Another point I want to make here is that notice that Jairus' daughter was 12 years old. We have a little girl here who has lived a very wonderful, charmed, beautiful life. She is beloved by her parents. She is the only child. She gives life, basically, to her parents, and so on. And yet, in a very short amount of time, she has come to the point where she is near death. The woman has lived an equal amount of time, 12 years, in which she has been alive and yet ceremonially dead to others. She doesn't have a physical death, but she is struggling because she is ostracized from everyone else. Okay? So we read here, and as soon as she touched him, and immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus had realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched me? Who touched my clothes?" Well, his disciples answered, you see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, "Who touched me?" But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." What I find interesting here is whether it was superstition or not for the lady to touch Jesus' clothes, it worked. She was healed. Now, we need to hear the voice of Jesus here. I read it where it sounded like, yeah, he's probably a little angry about this. I mean, who touched me? And so on. And I doubt very seriously that Jesus said it that way. It just looks like it if somebody was reading it, for the first time and not really understanding who Jesus was. It does sound like, two little kids in the back of the seat, "He touched me." And the result is, the father has to sit there and say, "Don't make me come back there." But I imagine more that Jesus said it more like this: "Who touched me? Who touched my garment? Somebody touched me." The other question here is, did he not know who it was? I mean, we've seen numerous examples in our study of where Jesus doesn't need to hear, he doesn't need to see, he doesn't need to feel. He knows what people are thinking. He knows what they are feeling. We have numerous examples that we've already studied. Simon the Pharisee, for example, who had invited him to dinner. And as such, he started thinking to himself about whether or not Jesus was a prophet, and Jesus knew exactly what he was thinking. We have the example of the Samaritan woman at the well, where Jesus knew her entire life story without having to really guess a heck of a lot about it. So it's interesting that he didn't know who she was. And so why did he not know her or her intent? Personally, it's my supposition, guess, conjecture that he did know, but was getting ready to set an example for what was going to happen. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Jesus turned and saw her. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, and seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling with fear and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told the whole truth, why she had touched him, and how she had been instantly healed. Jesus puts her eyes on her, and she knows that she is caught. But why would she be so terrified? Maybe Jesus really was angry when he asked the questions, but that's probably not it. Remember those Levitical restrictions. Although not a leper, she is unclean, and anyone that she touches or touches her is also unclean. She has just been in the midst of a large buffeting crowd and purposefully touched Jesus and was probably touching other people as well. So now she's having to come forth. She is in instant joy. She is healed. Everything that she has wanted, everything she has spent all the money on doctors for, everything is now okay. She is thrilled. And then all of a sudden, she's meeting up with fear. She's trembling. She's scared. And why is that? She has just made everybody she touched in the crowd unclean. She has made Jesus unclean, if that were actually possible, which it isn't. So, like I said, she has effectively made a lot of people unclean, and she has to confess that to them right then and there. We say here, we say a lot that by faith we are healed. Jesus says to her at this point, "Take heart, daughter. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Okay, well, this woman is probably not young enough for Jesus to refer to her as like a child. But I think it says something here in that in her faith, she is recognized as a child of God. And so that Jesus can call her daughter and explain, your faith has saved you. You know, Jesus normally speaks when he does a miracle. I mean, there's every once in a while he does something, some sort of physical thing, such as putting mud in the blind man's eyes and telling him to go to wash it out. But most of the time, all he has to do is speak. He didn't even have to speak on this miracle. She touched him. And that was all it took. Her faith in that she knew who Jesus was all that it took. So, Jesus, occasionally, here he didn't even have to speak to her. Faith saves. Well, we have another miracle to go to. As Jesus was speaking with her, servants from the house of Jairus arrive. And they come, and they give him the news that he did not want to hear. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? Jairus fell into despair. Perhaps if only Jesus had not been interrupted, they might have made it back there in time. I find it interesting that the servants said, "Don't bother the teacher." You see, I think they all knew who Jesus was. Capernaum was his home base for at least several months now. Everybody kind of knows who he is. I think Jairus and Jesus, since Jesus was often talking in their synagogues, preaching, he and Jairus were probably friends. And so when the child got sick, Jesus was nowhere to be around. He was fighting desperately to try and figure out what was wrong with his little girl. Now it's too late. Jesus is there. He went out, searched him, he got him, he was bringing him, and it was too late. Jesus, hearing this, but ignoring what they said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John. You know, have courage or don't be afraid is the most enumerated imperative in the Bible. We hear it all the time. Everybody has to say, everybody that meets an angel, the first thing the angel has to say is, have courage, don't be afraid. Jesus does not want Jairus to lose hope, so he offers assurance. Jairus had just witnessed an event of faith. How someone could be healed just by touching Jesus' cloak. Her faith had saved her. Jesus now wants Jairus to get back his faith and his hope and his belief that Jesus could do what he wanted him to do in the first place. It was fear that drove Jairus to action. But fear is usually the foe of faith. Next question is, why Peter, James, and John? Well, Jesus has numerous disciples around him. We discussed a month or two ago about several women that were actually part of his entourage that helped support the group and so on with all that they could do. And the result was that, they had a relatively large group of people. We know that when they needed to replace Judas as one of the apostles, they had a criteria of it had to be somebody that was with them from the very beginning. So just the named apostles were not the only ones that were following Jesus around. And so on. But he does have this 12 that he is setting up to become his main messengers to other people. But inside that circle are Peter, James, and John. It's these three were given special privileges. One of them is right here. Another one we see is in the Garden of Gethsemane, when those were the three that went with Jesus the furthest. Another one is when he is transfigured upon the mountain. And in that transfiguration, again, these were the three witnesses: Peter, James, and John. They are his core team. Um, now, so why would he leave the rest of the disciples? Well, one, he doesn't want the crowd anymore. He needs to be moving on. So it's my conjecture that he left the rest of the disciples there to dissuade the crowd from following him further. Because they're all traveling with him. If he just says, okay, you three come, the rest of you guys stay here, they have no purpose. So I think that this gave them a purpose for what they were supposed to do that helped dissuade the crowd. Of course, they're leaving one crowd and going to another. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly for the child. When Jesus entered Jairus' house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd, he said, "Why all this commotion and wailing? Stop crying and go away. The girl is not dead, but asleep." But they just laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. Certainly, there were probably some family members there. Obviously, Jairus' wife was there, but other family members were probably there as well. Somebody, in the time that Jairus had left to go find Jesus and the girl dying, somebody had to have collected all of these mourners that were there. These were probably all professional mourners. Mourning being professional mourners, originated in many cultures, all the way from Egypt all the way to China. And it was we have texts talking about them going back to at least the 14th century BC. It was primarily a career for women and musicians to lament the deceased and lead the people. And it was considered an art skill to be able to wail and cry and lament and talk about the person, to lead the crowds, and so on. Why weren't men in it? Men were supposed to be too stoic to be somebody that would lament like that. It was also a sign of your wealth and to kind of exaggerate your fame by the number of mourners that you and your family would have go with you to the burial ground. And so the Bible talks a lot about such mourners. It doesn't have the word professional in front of them, but we understand that that's what they were, and so on. But Amos chapter 5, 2 Chronicles chapter 35, Jeremiah chapter 9, they all bring up this idea of having professional mourners. Now, Jairus had obviously not summoned these mourners. Jairus summoned Jesus. Jairus was not looking for his daughter to die. He was looking for Jesus to raise her up, to heal her from her sickness. Of course, she is dead now. Question is, Jesus says the girl is not dead, but asleep. And there's a lot of discussion about why would he say something like that? Was she really asleep? Maybe in a coma or something of that nature, and he knows that through his divine knowledge, and that's why he's saying she's only asleep. Was Jesus equating death but being resurrected as only sleep? In the same way that we often do when we say that the dead are only asleep because we are expecting the resurrection of the dead. So that's one other possibility. I can't see Jesus lying about it. I think he would have said something about that. The mourner's reaction, of course, is to laugh. Now, the fact that they are all wailing and lamenting and all of a sudden go into laughter, you know, demonstrates the superficiality of the mourners. They could turn their emotions off and on at a moment's notice. And they knew that Jesus had not yet seen the girl, so how would he know? And the other big problem here is if there is no funeral, there is no pay for these professional mourners, which of course would be part of their goal. Well, Jesus gets a little huffy with them and he puts them all out. And after he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. There he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha koum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Her spirit returned, and immediately she stood up and walked around. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Like I said, Jesus speaks and miracles happen. He has the power of God. His first in the first miracle that we talked about, it was power over nature. In the second miracle, it was power over the spirit world. In the third, it was the power over illnesses that could not be cured. And the fourth one is that he has power over death itself. We've seen this same thing. A few months ago, we were talking about the first resurrection that Jesus did, the widow's son at the village of Nain. And he said almost the exact same thing. Young man, I say to you, get up. Another resurrection that we have not studied yet is Lazarus, come out. Jesus speaks, and it happens. Luke is the one that writes in there, her spirit returned. That's to confirm that she truly was dead and not asleep. Being practical, Talitha has been sick for at least a day or two. Terribly sick. She is unlikely to have eaten anything during that time, so Jesus simply says, hey, she needs some food. Now, obviously, the parents are astonished. They went from a ray of hope when Jesus had returned to total grief when they thought it was too late, to incredible joy when she is brought back to life. So our question here is, why would Jesus tell them that to keep it secret? At this, the parents were completely astonished, but he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about what had happened. But news of this spread throughout all the region. If all the mourners in the family knew that she was dead, it would be very, very difficult for the girl to appear alive and not have the news spread everywhere. This is not a secret that you can keep. There is some speculation that, by some theologians, I don't really buy into this much, but some theologians believe that recipients of miracles were sometimes, especially by somebody that was not particularly popular, like say with the Pharisees, that they would try to make recipients of miracles disappear, or at least get into serious trouble. We see this with the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda. When Jesus heals this paralytic that couldn't get into the pool and tells him, "Get up, take your mat, and go." The guy picks up his mat, and Pharisees jump all over his case about it, and they want to know how this happened, what happened, and so on. And they berate the guy for having been healed of a miracle. We can see it in the blind man who had been blind from birth. And the Sanhedrin calls him in and wants to know about this miracle, and because they just don't trust who Jesus is. And so they wanted to throw his parents out of the synagogue, throw him out of the synagogue for being the recipient of a miracle that gave him his eyesight. But there is no record at this time of there being risk of life for any recipient of a miracle. It could cause some ostracization with the wrong group. We can see that in our politics today. It could have been the reason that Jesus didn't want it well known was that he's already got these crowds coming at him constantly. And maybe he just needs to have a little more time to not have more and more things heaped upon him. Remember, this is all going to lead to the cross. But it's not necessarily the time at this juncture. It could be that, it could be that Jesus just knows that the news is going to come anyway. It really doesn't matter. But he just tells them that to keep them kind of out of sight and so on for a little while to let things cool down. And it's also possible that Jesus was just jesting with them, saying, okay, everybody's going to know this. Don't tell anybody. Okay? Don Francisco has a wonderful song about this miracle in which he takes Jairus through all of the emotions of going to seek Jesus, of finding out that the child is dead, of coming home and seeing his wife's vacant eyes, and just Jesus heals him and then says, don't mention a word. The last part of the song and the title of the song is, I gotta tell somebody. I gotta tell somebody what Jesus did for me. And the song kind of implies that Jairus just had no control. How's he not going to go and talk about this? About what Jesus had done for him? Whether Jairus was obedient and staying silent or not, it is Matthew who records. But the news spread throughout the region. Jesus said, I don't want anybody to know about this. It didn't matter. It was already out for everyone. Like I said, Mark always likes to paint Jesus as a man of action. That's what we have in all of these four miracles. Power over nature, power over the demon world, power over sickness, power over death. We are celebrating his power over death for his own resurrection. It is our hope, our faith, and our belief that at some point we will all spiritually follow through and be in the same place as Jesus. Amen.